The flames rise first in memory. A body bound, a crowd gathered, smoke twisting upward as bells toll across the Seine. The shouts of accusation are loud, but louder still is the silence that follows. In another place, far from the pyre, a drawer in the papal archive is opened, and within it lies a folded parchment, its ink whispering a different truth. A pardon signed, yet never spoken. Mercy, written, yet never proclaimed. Between fire and parchment, between noise and silence, the fate of the Templars seems to split into two worlds that never meet. What else might be hidden in these silences? A map that hints at coasts not yet known. Towers and vaults that endure but refuse to explain themselves. Symbols scratched in margins that murmur doubt more than confession. Were the Templars heretics, or were they only inconvenient to those in power? The silence does not answer, but it waits. This is Serene Myths. If you find comfort in wandering these quiet corridors of history, you are welcome to like, to subscribe, or to leave a note in the comments about the time of night you joined us. In silence, we keep company together. And so, let us begin. Walking slowly into the dim archive, where a locked drawer is opened, and a forgotten parchment begins to breathe once more. The stones breathe slowly in that hidden place beneath Rome, where the apostolic archive slumbers behind its locked doors. The air is thick with the fragrance of wax and the faint tang of iron keys that once scraped across locks older than the nations that claim dominion now. The corridor stretches long and silent, like a lung filled with dust. In the glow of lamps set low to protect fragile vellum, the shelves resemble ranks of silent sentinels guarding secrets that should have perished with the centuries. Here, among bindings cracked like parched earth, lies a folded letter. A parchment once ordinary, its fibers rough with age, but marked by a seal whose wax has fractured into a crescent. Not a perfect break, but a deliberate-looking arc, as though moonlight itself had pressed upon it. It was written in 1308, when Europe still trembled under the aftershock of arrests that shook the most feared order of knights. 3 cardinals, appointed by Pope Clement V, had examined the leaders of the Templar order in Chinon, a fortress on the Loire. Their task had been solemn, to weigh accusations that the knights had betrayed their vows, denied their faith, and bound themselves to strange rites. What they recorded was something less damning. Confessions shaded by fatigue and coercion, followed by absolution. Clement had pardoned them, at least in spirit, though his public voice would remain muted. This parchment was the whisper of forgiveness, carried not on trumpet or proclamation, but folded and stored, waiting for no reader. You can imagine your fingers brushing that crackled page, the ink faded but still legible, the Latin script curling like ivy. It does not shout, it does not accuse, it murmurs, "Absolve it, he absolved them." And yet the memory of torches in the squares of Paris, the smell of smoke-consuming flesh, makes the word tremble. To know they had been pardoned behind closed doors and condemned before the world is to feel the sting of silence sharpened into judgment. The archive itself conspires in this paradox. A place meant to preserve becomes also a place that conceals. For centuries, the Chinon parchment lay unseen, filed in an order so vast that its presence became an absence. Not until the early years of the 21st century did its existence come to light again. 700 years of stillness, a silence curated with as much care as the voices it contained. Was it oversight, or was it choice? The difference, at such a scale, is nearly impossible to untangle. The faint scent of mildew rides the air between volumes. The stones themselves sweat in the damp, leaving patches of discoloration like bruises upon the walls. One corridor runs darker than the others, its door sealed with iron bands. Some files withstood centuries in near-perfect condition, their bindings as sturdy as the day they were shelved, while others, equally valuable, dissolved to crumbs. The parchment from Chinon survived but hidden, as though chosen to slumber. Lean closer, and you hear the bells, not loud, but echoing from some distant tower above the city. The sound slips down stairwells, brushing against the stacks of paper and curling around your shoulders. A bell toll is not speech, not language, and yet it communicates more than words. It carries solemnity, inevitability, the passage of hours into nights. So too did Clement's parchment communicate without ever being allowed to speak aloud. There is a detail that lingers, almost playful in its strangeness. The crack in the wax seal, shaped not as random fracture but as a crescent moon, as though time itself decided to decorate the silence with a symbol. Perhaps it is meaningless, a trick of pressure, of storage, of expansion and contraction in centuries of fluctuating temperatures. Yet the eye insists on reading it as sign, a sign of night, of secrecy, of something incomplete. Even if meaningless, it enriches the imagination, for history never arrives to us whole, but in fragments shaped by decay and by accident. The mind stitches them into pattern, whether it is real or not. The parchment is an object both ordinary and miraculous. Its fibre is animal skin treated by hands long decomposed, its ink made from iron salts and tannin, its seal a mixture of resin and pigment. Nothing supernatural clings to it, and yet it survived storms, fires, wars and reforms, only to emerge centuries later as though it had been waiting. Scholars now pore over it, weighing every phrase, asking why a document of such import was not known to all. Was it lost by incompetence, or was it too convenient to remain out of sight? In the end, the parchment reveals as much about absence as it does about presence. The smell of wax grows stronger, as if a candle has just been snuffed nearby. Though the archive has long since banned open flames, perhaps the mind conjures it, weaving atmosphere from suggestion. Your eyes drift over the stacked bindings again, the embossed leather, the spines too cracked to show their titles. Each box, each folder, could contain the shadow of some other voice. How many absolutions were folded and forgotten? How many condemnations were written twice, once for public view and once for private conscience? The archive hums with questions that can never be answered, and in that hum lies the rhythm of history itself. The parchment is more than a record. It is a reminder that even absolution can be bound in silence, that forgiveness withheld from the ears of the world is as heavy as guilt. It whispers through centuries, telling us that the fate of the Templars was not decided in courtrooms or cathedrals, but in the refusal to let their absolution be heard. Silence became the sharpest sword, cutting more deeply than steel. As you step back from the document, the echo of bells fades. The air feels thicker, the shelves taller, the corridor narrower. The archive has reclaimed its possession. The parchment rests again, not erased, not destroyed, but tucked into the folds of memory where few will wander. Yet even there, it breathes a lesson. That history is not what is said, but what is left unsaid, what is hidden in drawers, what is delayed until centuries pass. The mist outside seems to seep through cracks, a pale breath upon the floor. Somewhere beyond the vault, the world of fire and trial awaits, where silence will not protect, but condemn. the story does not end in these hallways. It slips beyond them into the realm where documents disappear, where mold and flame act with suspicious precision, and where silence itself is curated with care. And so the path of wax, stone, and broken seals leads onward into the quiet erasures that history pretends are accidents. The archive is never truly silent. Paper shifts with the pressure of air, leather sighs when humidity rises, and stone walls echo with a breath that seems not entirely human. In these sounds lies the story of what survives and what is lost. It is not always the flames of violence that destroy memory. Often it is gentler, quieter forces that nibble at the edges of history. Fire does not rage indiscriminately. Sometimes it finds exactly the shelf it needs to consume. Mold does not bloom at random. It seems to prefer certain ledgers, leaving others nearby untouched. When one looks closely at the record of the Templars, a pattern emerges that feels less like coincidence and more like curation by an invisible hand. In Paris, collections were damaged in sudden blazes that spared devotional songbooks while swallowing volumes of interrogation. In other cities, water leaked in at convenient corners, staining pages of testimony while missing liturgical registers. The accidents of preservation align too neatly with the story of silence that already surrounds the order. It is as though the universe itself had developed a taste for particular kinds of memory, savouring some, discarding others. Of course, accidents are frequent in any building centuries old, but the rhythm of these accidents can almost be read like a script. Imagine pulling open a chest in one of these repositories, the lid creaking, the smell of rot rushing out. Inside, documents lie in a state of half-life. Some bindings hold strong, their covers treated with oil that resisted damp, gleaming darkly like armor kept polished. Others, bound in humble cloth, fall apart at a single touch, their fibers chewed to dust. The oilskin lasts, the fabric fails. It is a banal detail, a technicality of material, yet it becomes a metaphor for survival itself. The choice of binding was never meant to decide what truth would endure, and yet it has. The smell is pungent like mushrooms growing in shadow. Fingers come away dusted with tiny spores, as though even touch accelerates destruction. On the edge of a manuscript, one sees black spots blooming into flowers of decay, spreading faster on some pages than others. The Templar records appear curiously vulnerable. Accounts of church councils, papal bulls, and land grants rest nearby in good health, as though protected by some unseen charm, while testimonies of knights accused of heresy collapse into crumbs. To notice such imbalance is to wonder if it is mere chance, or if someone, somewhere along the centuries, encouraged chance to lean one way rather than the other. There are accounts of fire breaking out in rooms curiously devoted to trial records. The flames seemed almost polite, declining to leap across stone thresholds into safer areas, content with the destruction of a single collection. Once the flames cooled, the archives reported their regrets, their condolences to memory, but also their relief that the damage had been contained. Contained, a word heavy with irony, contained not only in space, but in subject matter, trimming away precisely what made history uncomfortable. The archivist's world is full of such mysteries. Scholars today pore over surviving indices that mention books no longer there. Register of Templar Confessions, one note says, followed by the fatal word perdidit, lost. Another inventory lists items missing after damp spread from the lower floors, but when compared to later lists, certain categories of record always seem to carry heavier losses. The trial of knights, the petitions for mercy, the letters requesting delay, all subject to accidents, all fragile in ways other writings are not. You can feel the chill in such a room, a dampness that lingers even in memory. To sit there is to imagine the intent behind absence. Was it neglect, as careless as leaving a window unlatched? Or was it the careful choice of what to neglect, ensuring that time's appetite had the right meal? The difference between accident and intention is often impossible to prove, yet the result is the same. The silence grows thicker, insulating power from scrutiny. There are whispers among historians of a curated silence, a phrase that feels more like poetry than fact, but carries a kernel of truth. Documents that supported absolution went missing. Those that confirmed guilt survived more often. In Avignon, where papal courts worked slowly and deliberately, watermarks align with the very pages that offered nuance, smearing ink into illegibility. A reader can still see lines of text nearby, crisp and clear, while the words pleading for clemency have blurred into stains. The lamp's glow flickers as though to emphasize the fragility of sight. Shadows lengthen across spines, exaggerating their cracks into gashes. You might imagine the archives as a forest, its trunks the bindings of books, its canopy the ceilings heavy with dust. In that forest, some trees rot quickly while others endure. It is not always the strongest wood that survives, but the wood chosen by soil and rain. So too in these records, survival is not fair, not balanced, not impartial. It is selective, and selection tells its own story. Some scholars insist it is a story of nothing more than material science. Oilskin resists, cloth decays, stone thresholds prevent the spread of fire. Coincidence rules all. Yet others cannot ignore how the accidents align with the needs of power. Fire, damp, and moth seem to know which side of history to favor. Whether guided by hand or by chance, the outcome is the same. A body of records that speaks loudly in accusation and whispers only faintly in absolution. The imagination lingers on that imbalance. It grows like the mold itself, filling every crevice of thought. To hold in your hands a register missing every other page is to wonder what voices spoke in the gaps. Were they cries for mercy? Explanations of ritual misunderstood? Or did they confess to things more dangerous still, things the Church itself found best forgotten? The absences grow louder the longer one looks at them. Silence becomes its own artifact. Not just the silence of forgotten voices, but the silence created by accidents too neat to be natural. The walls seem to know, the stones breathing with an indifference that conceals as much as it reveals. The bells outside toll again, muffled through thick masonry, their sound bending like mist. Their rhythm reminds you that time always moves on, and with time, memory erodes. Yet sometimes erosion is not enough. Sometimes silence requires a gardener. As you imagine the careful gardener of silence, pruning memory so that only certain branches remain, the next figure comes into focus. He is not a pope or a king, not a knight in armor or a bishop in a mitre. He is a clerk, a notary, a man with ink on his fingers and patterns in his mind. His name was Imber, and through his careful shaping of testimony, he tended the story of the Templars as one prunes a hedge. The silence of fire and mould was one kind. The silence of editing was another, perhaps more dangerous still. The papal city of Avignon was heavy with incense and dust. The Rhone moved sluggishly nearby, reflecting the pale grey sky, and the air around the papal residence seemed to carry both sanctity and exhaustion. Here Clement V ruled, a pope not in Rome, but in exile of sorts, dwelling in a court pressed between French kings and the expectations of Christendom. He was not a man of thunder, he was a man who delayed, who paused, who let silence do the work of words. And in that silence the fate of the Templars was sealed. It was 1312 when the papal bull, Vox in Excelso, emerged, formally dissolving the order of the Temple. The document bore Clement's authority, though it danced carefully around the accusation of heresy. It did not proclaim that the knights were guilty of worshipping false idols or spitting on the cross. It did not thunder condemnation, instead it spoke in quieter terms of scandal, of suspicion, of the difficulty of maintaining peace. It dissolved the order not because it was convicted, but because it was inconvenient. Their properties, their wealth, their fortresses, these would pass to the Hospitallers, the other great military order, safer and less troublesome. Yet the words never declared the Templars heretics. The silence itself became their judgment. To walk in Avignon at the time was to sense this peculiar atmosphere. Bells rang from towers, but without joy, a dull resonance absorbed by the damp stones of the city. Clement's letters to monarchs had grown fewer, shorter, colder. Each one seemed to remove a little warmth, as though he were withdrawing into a shell of necessity. His health too faltered. Reports spoke of a man often ill, burdened by headaches and weariness. Yet still he bore the weight of Philippe IV of France, the king who had begun the campaign against the Templars in 1307. The king demanded condemnation, demanded punishment, demanded confiscation, and Clement, though he tried to resist, yielded step by step until his voice was no longer voice but echo. Imagine standing before him in his chamber. The room smells of beeswax and sweat, the thick draperies stifling in the spring air. He sits slouched, his fingers stained with ink, his lips pressed together, not in decision but in hesitation. He does not raise his voice. He does not call down thunder from heaven. He simply allows the machinery of law and counsel to proceed till silence accomplishes what proclamation could not. His is a politics of omission, and in omission the Templars found their end. Vox in Excelso reads like a sigh. Its words, preserved on parchment, avoid the ferocity of earlier papal condemnations. They carry none of the fury of bulls against heresy, none of the thunder once unleashed upon Cathars or pagans. Instead, it is the language of fatigue, of caution, of carefully avoiding the sharpest words. Yet its effect was no less devastating. The order of the Temple, once spread across Europe and the Holy Land, ceased to exist with a sentence that never named them guilty. It is like hearing a bell that does not ring but still commands silence. Scholars debate the degree to which Clement's health played a role. Some argue that illness made him pliant, too weary to resist the demands of the French crown. Others see in his silence a calculated move to dissolve the order without setting the dangerous precedent of formally branding them heretics. By refusing the word heretic, Clement avoided an irreversible judgment, but by dissolving them anyway, he satisfied the king. In that balance, he chose survival of the papacy over the survival of the knights. One can picture him at night, lying awake in Avignon, hearing bells from the distant towers. The candles gutter, leaving smoke trails across the beams, the scent of wax heavy in the air. He coughs, his chest tight. He thinks of letters waiting to be written, but his quill remains still. Each day that passes without a definitive proclamation is another day in which silence does the work for him. Delay itself becomes a verdict. There is a strangeness in the bull's structure. It acknowledges scandal, acknowledges rumors, acknowledges the disturbance caused by the accusations, yet it stops short of confirming them. It is like a judge who sentences a man not because he is guilty, but because the crowd outside the court demands punishment. Such a sentence cannot be appealed. It is final, yet it admits no guilt. It is a sword that cuts without claiming to strike. Outside the papal chambers, Avignon bustled with merchants and pilgrims. But even there the mood was muted. The smoke of cooking fires hung low in the air. The Rhone smelled of silt and fish, and soldiers lingered in courtyards with unease. Everyone knew the king's shadow stretched over the papacy. Everyone knew the knights who once guarded pilgrims and fought Saracens now sat in prisons, their fate sealed not by thunderous accusation, but by the hush of delay. The silence was not absolute. In some letters, Clement expressed regret. In some corners of the archive, one finds phrases suggesting hesitation. Yet in the end, his decision was written not in what he said, but in what he refused to say. The omission was more powerful than declaration. By not branding them heretics, he left a crack in the seal of history. By dissolving them anyway, he ensured that the crack would never widen into freedom. Picture again the parchment of Vox in Excelso. Its fibers are rough, the ink dark against the pale skin. The script is formal, measured, precise, yet between its lines lies weariness. One can almost hear the Pope's breath, shallow, reluctant. He writes because he must, not because he believes. The bells ring in the distance again, tolling the hours, tolling the years. Each toll brings the nights closer to fire. Clement's silence became a decree more enduring than any words he might have chosen. In dissolving the Templars without condemning them, he preserved the appearance of order while ensuring the destruction of men. The world heard no accusations, no thunder, no cry of heresy. It heard only the quiet shuffle of paper, the sigh of a weary man, and the silence that followed. That silence, heavier than stone, sealed the fate of the order. The Rhone flowed on, carrying whispers downstream, past vineyards and villages, into the sea. The papal palace continued to echo with footsteps. The bells continued to toll. The silence became part of the rhythm of Avignon, and through that silence, judgment was delivered. Beyond the parchment, beyond the damp stone of Avignon, the story continued to unfold in two directions, one public, one private. On the surface, the condemnation marched on with councils and processions and flames. Beneath the surface, quieter notes of hesitation, of forgiveness, of doubt remained hidden, tucked into margins, preserved in secret drawers. Two tracks running parallel, never meeting, yet shaping one another. The public story of guilt, the private story of absolution. And between them, the silence of Clement V, as sharp and final as a bell that refuses to stop ringing. The square of Paris was loud with torches. They hissed in the damp air, their flames leaning sideways in the evening wind, painting the faces of the crowd with restless orange. Chains rattled as men were led forward, their white mantles now dirt-stained, their red crosses obscured by soot. Jacques de Molay, last Grand Master of the Templars, stood among them. His lips moved, not in confession, but in denial of guilt. He spoke words of innocence, words of faith. They carried only so far before the roar of fire swallowed them. The crowd heard condemnation. The parchment hidden in Avignon whispered absolution. Two tracks of history ran at once, parallel, contradictory, never meant to meet. The public record shouted with conviction. Court transcripts compiled under the authority of king and inquisitor bristled with accusations, denial of Christ, obscene initiation rites, strange kisses of shame. These texts read like thunder, their words sharp, their patterns uniform. They spoke of guilt, of betrayal, of a brotherhood lost to darkness. They were meant to be read aloud, copied widely, preserved as lessons for generations. They were the loud voice of power, filling the air with certainty. But alongside them, folded quietly into drawers and margins, lay other voices, private notes, hesitant memoranda, and above all, the Chinon parchment, which recorded absolution. These did not thunder, they murmured. They were not displayed, they were shelved. They admitted hesitation, confessed uncertainty, and in some cases leaned toward mercy. They were not meant to stop the fire, only to soothe a conscience. They were the soft voice of doubt, hidden under the loud voice of authority. Imagine standing with both documents before you, one a transcript of public trial, the other the secret parchment of absolution. On one page the words condemn, on the other the words forgive. The ink is the same, the script similar, the parchment fibers identical in texture. Yet the destinies they carry could not be more different. To hold them side by side is to feel history split in two like a river divided at a fork, each branch telling a different story, yet both flowing toward the same sea of silence. There is something uncanny in this duality. The louder the accusation grew, the more carefully the absolution was hidden. It is as though secrecy itself was a form of confession, an admission that the truth did not align neatly with the punishment. The leaders had been pardoned, yet they burned. The Pope had hesitated, yet he dissolved their order. The records were split, yet both were true in their own way. It was a choreography of contradiction, orchestrated by silence. In the margins of one such record, a small addendum appeared, a supplementary note sewn into the final page, bearing a voice that trembled with regret. Some claim it resembled the handwriting of Clement himself. Others argue it was only a clerk inserting formulae of closure. But the words carried the tone of penance, as though the act of condemnation required its own confession. A small stitch, literally sewn into parchment, as if guilt itself needed to be hidden between the threads. The practice of sewing in addenda was not unusual in medieval record-keeping. Pages were stitched, bindings reinforced, errors corrected by inserting scraps. But when the words themselves tremble with apology, the act becomes more than clerical habit. It becomes an echo of conscience, a whisper that even power cannot silence itself completely. The thread marks remain visible, like scars across vellum, physical proof of hesitation. Picture those final pages, the parchment slightly thicker where new sheets have been attached, the seams running like veins beneath the skin. A reader turns the last folio and feels the shift, hears the crinkle of thread. The words there carry a different weight, less legal, more human. They speak not of law, but of sorrow, not of guilt, but of weariness. They suggest that beneath the roar of condemnation, some heart in Avignon still quivered with doubt. Meanwhile, outside, Jacques de Molay's voice rose once more, declaring innocence before flames consumed him. His words did not alter the official record, but they live in chronicles written by those who pitied him. Thus another layer was added, public guilt, private absolution, and posthumous vindication whispered by sympathizers. History became a tapestry of three threads, woven together by silence, never perfectly aligned. The bells of Paris tolled as the fire raged. The bells of Avignon tolled as the parchment was filed. Across the distance, the two sounds merged in imagination, one marking death, the other marking concealment. Together they formed a harmony of dissonance, the music of contradiction that defines the Templars' fate. The motif of silence returns here as both instrument and verdict. Silence between proclamations, silence between acts of writing, silence between the voices of men who believed they had done enough to be pardoned and the world that insisted on burning them. That silence is thicker than smoke, denser than stone, and it clings to every record that survives. The scholar reading centuries later must piece together both tracks. The loud voice of public condemnation is easy to hear. It echoes in chronicles, in sermons, in repeated accusations. The soft voice of private mercy is harder to discern, buried in archives, revealed only when threads are undone and drawers opened. To reconcile them is impossible. One does not cancel the other. They remain in tension,
Whispers.
two tracks running parallel through time, never crossing, never merging, yet each essential. The addendum sewn to the parchment is a fitting symbol. It reminds us that history itself is often sewn, patched, corrected, hidden. The seams are visible if one knows where to look. The historian becomes a tailor of memory, feeling for threads, tracing stitches, reading not only words but the hands that placed them. And always, silence remains the fabric on which the stitches rest. Step back, and the duality becomes almost theatrical. The stage of Paris blazes with spectacle, smoke rising into the night sky, the crowd murmuring prayers and curses. The stage of Avignon, by contrast, is hushed, lit only by a single candle over parchment, a pope hunched in fatigue, a clerk adding one last line of regret. Two plays performed simultaneously, one for the masses, one for the shadows, each shaping the memory of the same event. You hear the bells again, faint but insistent, and they seem to bind the two stages together. The bells toll for fire and for silence, for death and for concealment. They toll for a judgment never spoken aloud, but carried out nonetheless. Their echo fades slowly, like mist sinking into forest, carrying you from the public square and the papal chamber toward the figure who orchestrated the testimonies themselves. The voice of accusation had its conductor, the ghost editor, who shaped confessions with ink and pen. From silence born of omission, we pass now into silence born of editing. And before we leave this chapter, let the thought linger gently, without urgency. If you find it striking that history speaks in whispers as often as in proclamations, perhaps you might subscribe or share these reflections. It is a way of keeping company with voices that were not meant to be lost, a way of allowing silence itself to be heard. The fire had burned away the voices of men, but on paper their words still lingered, pressed into lines by clerks whose hands cramped in the candlelight. And among those clerks one figure stands out, though not for fame or authority. His name was Guillaume Imbert, a notary, a man without banners or knights, yet his pen cut deeper than any sword. If silence was a verdict for Clement, then shaping silence into confession was the labour of Imbert. Imagine the courtroom of the early 14th century. It was not a grand theatre of justice, as in later centuries, but a hall of stone, low-ceilinged, smoky with torches, air thick with damp. The accused were brought in, weary from prison, their hair matted, their skin pale from darkness. Chains rattled when they tried to stand. Around them sat clerks, notaries, officials of varying rank. They did not brandish weapons, they wielded parchment, quills, wax seals. Imbert was among them, his quill scratching in rhythm with the questions. The process of interrogation was a ritual as rigid as any liturgy. Questions repeated themselves in slightly altered forms, pressing down until the accused bent. Did you deny Christ? Did you spit on the cross? Did you renounce your vows? The words were prepared in advance, like the script of a play. The accused could stumble, hesitate, mumble, but Imbert ensured the record was clean. Where speech wavered, writing smoothed. Where doubt surfaced, ink imposed order. He was the ghost editor of confession, the unseen author behind the chorus of guilt. His work reveals itself in the patterns. Across distant regions, from Paris to smaller towns of the north, the transcripts echo each other. The phrasing repeats, the sequence of accusations aligns, the formula for repentance matches word for word. This is not the random scatter of spontaneous speech. It is the architecture of design. To read them side by side is to see a template, a mold into which confessions were poured. Conform to the northern pattern, one directive read, a phrase that captures both the geography and the uniformity. Picture Imbert at his desk, ink staining the side of his thumb, quill cutting across parchment with deliberate pressure. He is not cruel by appearance, he is methodical. He adjusts phrases so that uncertainty becomes admission, hesitation becomes affirmation. A knight mutters, "I do not recall." On paper it becomes, he confessed that at initiation he denied Christ. The ink erases ambiguity, the record gains clarity, but the clarity is shaped, sculpted. It is the silence of doubt transformed into the firmness of guilt. The room smells of tallow and sweat, torches spit resin. The accused sit, slumped, their wrists rubbed raw by shackles. Their voices crack, sometimes refusing, sometimes giving way. The clerk does not falter. The pen moves steadily, capturing not the living tremor of words, but the finished structure expected by authority. Imbert's face is pale, expressionless. He does not weep, does not smile, does not rage. He is a conduit, but a conduit who filters. His silence is not absence, it is transformation. There is something almost mechanical about the way the transcripts unfold. Each confession slots neatly into a framework, regardless of the man speaking. The uniformity is uncanny, as though all the knights had rehearsed the same play. But it was not rehearsal, it was editing. The ghost in the record is not the accused, but the notary. The text is not only what was said, but what was shaped, and that shaping belongs to Imbert. Historians today debate the degree of manipulation. Was Imbert simply a clerk following rigid procedure, ensuring clarity and order in chaotic testimony? Or was he an architect, designing a narrative to please inquisitors and kings? The truth likely lies between. He did not invent words from nothing, but he arranged them to form a chorus. He ensured that every discordant note was harmonized into the melody of guilt. The repetition of structure, the smoothing of contradictions, the insistence on pattern, all speak to a deliberate hand. The bells outside the court would toll as sessions ended. Their sound fell heavy on the ears of prisoners who knew each ring brought them closer to judgment. Imbert too would hear them, quill still in hand, his eyes red from strain. For him, the bells marked not doom, but closure. Another record complete, another confession sealed. The sound of steel striking steel in the smithy down the street echoed faintly in the night, a reminder that truth here was not forged in hearts but in ink. You may imagine his workshop as an extension of the courtroom. At night, by dim lamplight, he would review pages, correcting slips, inserting phrases, tightening structure. The scratches of revision still visible in margins tell us this was no casual copying. It was editing, polishing. A knight's denial scratched out, replaced with a softer but damning phrase. A hesitation reframed as partial admission. The silence of what was not said filled with words of what must be said. The parchment smells of iron gall ink, sharp and metallic, the odor clinging to fingers. This is the craft of silence turned into text. Not silence as in nothing, but silence as in transformation, the reshaping of uncertainty into narrative. The accused might not even recognize their own words when read back to them. Yet once recorded, once sealed, the words became theirs. The ink imprisoned them as surely as the chains did. There is a strange kind of power in this clerical labor. It lacks the drama of kings or popes, yet it directs the outcome all the same. Imber's pen guided the story of the Templars as surely as Clement's silence or Philippe's ambition. Without his patterns, the accusations might have dissolved into contradiction. With them, they became a chorus, consistent, believable, damning. And so the trial produced two kinds of silence. The first was the silence of Clement's decree, dissolving the order without naming guilt. The second was Imber's silence, smoothing testimony until it spoke only one language. Both silences worked together, one official, one clerical, to craft the fate of the knights. One silence dissolved them in law, the other dissolved them in memory. The bells toll again, faint across the centuries, and their sound blends with the scratching of quills. One can almost hear the echo of steel across parchment, the quill like a blade carving into skin. The confessions, shaped and polished, remain as monuments to a silence louder than words. And just at the edge of the page, where ink bleeds into margin, other voices begin to appear. Symbols, marks, strange figures left by clerks perhaps uneasy with the harmony imposed. They do not shout, but they murmur. They live not in the text, but beside it, waiting to be noticed. The parchment lies flat on the desk, its surface rough with the scars of centuries. Ink spreads like veins across its skin, but in the margins, something stranger resides. Not words, not official sentences, but shapes. Marks small enough to be dismissed as doodles, yet persistent enough to demand attention. A crescent, drawn faintly as though the pen hesitated. A spiral curling inward like smoke. A fish sketched with two quick strokes, its eye no bigger than a grain of sand. They seem at first accidental, yet when they repeat across different volumes, the pattern begins to whisper. Clerks in the medieval world were not machines. Their pens wandered when their thoughts did. Marginalia, as scholars call it, fills manuscripts across Europe, faces half-formed, hands pointing, beasts playing instruments. But in the records of the Templars, the signs feel more restrained, more deliberate. They are not playful caricatures, but coded gestures, subtle interruptions in the flow of accusation, a crescent near the word confession, a spiral beside a doubtful answer, a tiny fish in a page, otherwise full of guilt. It is as though the margins carried the voices of those who could not speak openly. You lean closer, the smell of ink, iron-rich, sharp against your nose. The parchment fibers rise and fall like hills, and within those valleys the marks reside. The crescent gleams faintly, darker than surrounding text, a sliver of night inside the law. The spiral seems to move when the eye follows it, winding deeper, as though into thought itself. The fish is simple, childlike, but in its simplicity lies strength. To draw a fish in the margin of a heresy trial was no accident. It was the oldest symbol of hidden faith, used by Christians themselves in times of persecution. Did some clerk, weary of transforming doubt into guilt, place it there as a silent protest? Of course, other explanations exist. A spiral may have been nothing more than a test of a quill's nib. A crescent might be the start of a letter abandoned. The fish could be a flourish or a scribe's idle hand, sketching the commonest Christian sign, yet the recurrence unsettles. Why do such shapes appear precisely beside passages of ambiguity? Why do they haunt the very sentences where knights stammered, denied, or resisted? Silence lives not only in the absence of words, but also in the presence of marks too small to shout. Imagine the clerk at his desk, lamplight flickering, the air thick with wax and sweat. He copies dutifully, the rhythm of questions and answers, steady as a chant. His superior expects a clean transcript, one that conforms to pattern. But his hand betrays him. As he writes the words, "I denied Christ," his pen slips aside to make a crescent, a silent moon watching the line. When a knight mutters, "I do not believe what they accuse me of," the clerk writes the official record but lets his quill linger, curling into a spiral. He cannot change the text, but he can mark the edge. The bells outside toll, the sound slipping in through narrow windows. They echo against stone, vibrating in the clerk's chest as he scratches the page. Each toll reminds him that time moves on, that judgment looms. His marks are tiny rebellions, small breaths in the suffocating air of uniformity. He knows they may be ignored, dismissed as doodles. Yet perhaps he hopes someone someday will notice that the silence will not be complete. Scholars argue about these marks. Some insist they are ordinary marginalia, the kind that fills manuscripts everywhere, devoid of hidden meaning. Others see in them the fingerprints of conscience. They point out that the fish, in particular, was not a neutral sign. In the age of the early church, it was a secret signal among persecuted believers. To place it beside the coerced confessions of knights is to hint that they, too, suffered persecution. The spiral, often used in mystical diagrams, could suggest a turn inward, a protest without words. The crescent, the moon, the night, it speaks of secrecy, of things seen in shadow. To hold such a page in your hands is to feel the tension between official record and private gesture. The text shouts guilt, the margin murmurs doubt. The reader must decide which voice to trust. Perhaps the clerk never meant to challenge authority, only to soothe his own heart. Perhaps he left a trail for the future. Either way, the marks remain, carrying whispers across 7 centuries. The room of the archive is cool. The light from a single lamp pools over the page. Dust motes drift like spirits. You trace the spiral with your eyes and feel yourself drawn inward, as though into a well of silence. The fish seems to swim away from the lines of accusation, slipping into the margin where authority cannot follow. The crescent glows faintly, a fragment of night smuggled into daylight. Together they form a language beneath the language, a script beneath the script. It is tempting to read too much, to see codes where none were intended, to weave conspiracy from doodles. The historian must resist, must balance imagination with caution. Yet even caution admits that these shapes exist, that they appear not once but many times, and that they cluster near the most fragile testimonies. Silence is not only absence, sometimes it is a crescent in the corner, a fish at the bottom of the page, a spiral turning inward. Picture again the clerk, his hand trembling slightly as he dips the quill. He has written line after line, shaping the voices of knights into confessions. His ears ring with their mutters, their tears, their denials. He cannot record them as they were spoken. His duty is to record them as they are required. And so, as the ink flows, he leaves a fragment of himself in the margin. He leaves what cannot be said as what cannot be erased. Outside, mist gathers against the windows, pressing its cold breath into the room. The bells toll again, slow, mournful. The clerk scratches a final line, then pauses. In the corner of the page, his pen curves into another crescent. He blows gently to dry the ink, watching it glisten, then darken. He closes the book. The voices are silent, the record complete. Yet the margin hums with something else. When centuries pass and the pages are opened again, the marks still glisten faintly. They are not loud enough to overturn verdicts, but they are enough to suggest that silence was never total. They hint at resistance, however small, at memory trying to survive. They remind us that even in the most controlled narratives, someone, somewhere, tried to leave a sign. And as you linger with these margins, as the spiral draws your gaze inward, and the crescent glows against the parchment, the thought grows that the most dangerous place in any book is the last page. For it is there that addenda are sown, corrections made, regrets hidden. The margin leads inevitably to the end, where silence is gathered, stitched, and made final. The sound of parchment turning is softer than a sigh, yet it carries a gravity greater than thunder. To reach the end of a medieval register is to arrive at a threshold. The last page is not simply the conclusion of a record, it is its stage of concealment, its hidden chamber. In these final leaves, things are undone or redone, corrections slip between lines. Addenda are sown where no eye expected them. Entire tones shift at the very edge of memory, as though history itself preferred to speak in footnotes rather than in proclamations. In the Templar records, the last page became notorious. Testimonies ran on in uniform patterns, accusations, responses, confessions, polished into neat shapes, until the final folio. And then suddenly something changed. There would be an insertion, a sheet stitched into the binding, a voice that trembled differently. Sometimes it bore words of apology, sometimes of hesitation, sometimes of strange reassurance. It was as though the clerks, after copying hours of guilt, could not resist leaving a trace of doubt at the very end. The needle and thread did more than hold parchment together, they held conscience. Imagine one such volume spread before you. The earlier pages are filled with ordered lines, the Latin script steady, the margins tidy. Then, at the back, a page bulges slightly, its edge rougher, its alignment imperfect. You run a finger down the seam and feel the stitches, tiny holes piercing the skin of parchment, darker from the oil of fingers long dead. Here, something was added after the fact. The ink looks slightly fresher, though centuries have dulled its shine. The hand that wrote it leans differently, more hurried, less formal. And the words, they suggest regret, sorrow, a reluctance to let silence rest so heavily. The smell of parchment changes too. The older leaves are dry, brittle, carrying the faint musk of centuries. The sewn sheet smells sharper, more metallic, as though its ink has bled more deeply into the fibers. The very scent testifies that it does not belong to the original rhythm. It is an intrusion, a whisper, stitched into a chorus of conformity. Why the last page? Because the last page is both vulnerable and powerful. It is the space where additions may be tucked without disturbing the flow of what came before. A clerk might dare not alter the middle where supervisors checked carefully, But at the end, one might insert a phrase, a prayer, a correction. It is the place where weariness loosens control, where conscience has its last chance. The final page becomes a stage for hesitation, a platform for voices that dared not speak earlier. Scholars today debate the meaning of one particular addendum. The hand, some argue, resembles that of Clement himself. The ink trails slightly, the letters bear the tremor of illness. If true, the Pope may have sewn into the end of a record his own confession, not of crime, but of doubt. Others dismiss this, pointing out the handwriting matches lesser clerks, not the pontiff. Yet the words themselves remain remarkable, for they speak with a softer tone, one that recognizes the knights had suffered, one that leans toward absolution rather than condemnation. To imagine Clement bent over such a page is to picture a weary man. His head aches, his chest rattles with sickness. The candle sputters, casting long shadows. He dips his pen, writes slowly, perhaps with hesitation. Each letter forms like a drop of conscience upon the page. Then the sheet is sewn into the register, not at the front where power announces itself, but at the back, where silence collects. The Pope's public voice remained firm in vox, in Excelso, but if his private hand left a softer mark at the end of a trial record, it would mean that even at the pinnacle of authority, conscience sought its refuge in the margins. Of course, certainty is impossible. The handwriting may not be Clement's. The words may be nothing more than clerical formula. Yet the possibility itself breathes life into the addendum. It is contested, and in that contest, the imagination stirs. For the very act of debate shows that silence was never complete. Something resisted, however faintly. Something whispered through the stitches. The bells outside Avignon tolled as these additions were made, their sound pressed against the windows, vibrating through stone, reminding the scribes of time's slow procession. The final page carried that same solemn toll, as though each added word echoed the bell's resonance. The act of sewing was like the sound of a clapper striking bronze, sharp, decisive, unavoidable. The seam across the parchment became the seam across history, dividing what was official from what was hidden. Picture the scribe's hands. One holds the parchment steady, the other guides the needle threaded with coarse linen. The thread bites into skin as it pulls tight. Each puncture leaves a scar in the vellum. The sound is faint, like a whisper, yet it carries weight. Through these tiny holes, conscience slips into the record. Through these stitches, silence is both enforced and broken. The reader, centuries later, encounters the seam and feels the tension. On one side lies the clean, uniform chorus of guilt. On the other, the addendum with its softer tone. The mind hesitates. Which speaks the truth? The majority of pages condemn, but the last whispers otherwise. The historian is left unsettled, compelled to read between the lines, to listen for what the silence hides. Never trust the last page, the proverb could say, for it is where history reveals its hesitation, yet never ignore it either, for it may be the only place where conscience survives. The paradox is complete. The very spot most likely to be manipulated is also the place most likely to reveal truth. It is the liminal space, the threshold between record and silence. The candle burns lower. The archive grows colder. You can almost feel the breath of mist slipping through the cracks, curling around the final pages. The seam glistens faintly, thread catching light like a scar in moonshine. The bells toll once more, and their echo feels like a needle passing through layers of air, stitching the night together. From here, the story widens again, for the last page is not only about what was written, but about what was mapped, notations that hinted at connections between places, trails of silence spreading from Chinon to La Rochelle to Avignon. The seam of the last page leads into the cartography of absence, into a network of debated claims and contested symbols. The thread pulls the reader onward into maps and monuments that may or may not belong to the Templars, but which hum with their echo. The ink of the last page has barely dried in the imagination when another surface spreads open, a map. Not parchment filled with testimony, but parchment filled with coastlines, rivers, and marks of navigation. It is called the Carta di Sabatier, a name that drifts like mist through scholarship, a chart whispered about rather than proclaimed. On it, some see a coastline too precise, too modern, a drawing that seems to anticipate the eastern shores of South America centuries before Columbus. Others dismiss it as coincidence, a trick of resemblance, a contour that only appears clear when hindsight insists on clarity. But whether true or not, the map folds itself into the same story of absence and silence. It suggests the Templars might have carried knowledge beyond their time, knowledge filed away like absolution in the Vatican, hidden in ink lines across vellum. Imagine the map spread on a wooden table in a chamber above the port of La Rochelle. The harbour below smells of salt and tar, the creak of masts carrying across the air.
What is this?
Sailors call to one another, gulls wheel in the dusk, and the sound of bells drifts from the town's church towers. On the chart, rivers snake inland, bays curve with uncanny familiarity, and in the margin a watermark whispers its origin. A faint design pressed into the fibres links the paper to a shipment associated with La Rochelle, the Templars' great western port, their gateway to the Atlantic. The spiral we traced in margins of confession now becomes a spiral of coasts, curling outward into ocean. The crescent, once drawn beside words of denial, now glimmers as a crescent bay inked on a map. Even the little fish reappears, not sketched this time, but implied in the shoals drawn along the shore. Whether by intention or by coincidence, the symbols echo across genres, from trial records to cartographic speculation. Scholars tread carefully here. They warn that maps are among the most deceptive artifacts of all. Coastlines change, paper warps, imagination fills gaps. What looks like Brazil to a modern eye may have been nothing more than a stylized flourish, a way to balance composition. And yet the allure persists. For the Templars, who vanished in smoke and silence, any suggestion of escape, of survival beyond the reach of kings and popes, clings like mist to their legend. A map with a coastline out of time becomes less an artifact than a dream that not everything ended at the stake. The bells toll again, their resonance stretching across sea and stone. From La Rochelle, they echo southward across the vineyards, through valleys, until they reach Avignon. In the papal court, clerks file records, bishops convene councils, Clement weighs his silence. Yet on the desk of a cartographer far away, another silence takes shape, the silence of knowledge not meant to be uttered, drawn instead in faint ink lines along a sea's edge. You lean closer to the Carta di Sabatier. Its paper bears scars of folding, its edges water-stained. The smell of sea air seems to cling to it, though centuries separate you from its origin. Tiny notations appear along the coasts, dots, symbols, faint scratches. They are as enigmatic as the crescents and spirals in trial records, Were they markers of trade? Were they merely decorations? Or were they another language beneath the language, a code only initiates would understand? The historian feels the same unease here as with the last page of testimony. The artifact is real, yet its meaning is contested. Some argue passionately that it shows knowledge impossible for its time. Others remind us of chance, of resemblance, of the human tendency to see patterns where none exist. The debate itself becomes part of the silence. For every voice that proclaims revelation, another insists on restraint. And in the tension between, the map continues to whisper. In La Rochelle's port, waves slap against the hulls of ships. The steel of anchors rings against stone quays. Lanterns bob, their flames bending in the wind. Somewhere, perhaps, a knight once stood, listening to the bells, watching the tide. Did he imagine escape across that ocean? Did he believe maps could carry them to safety beyond the king's reach? Or was it only the dream of later centuries, sowing hope into silence? Back in Avignon, the papal palace rises like a fortress. Its stones hold secrets as tightly as any vault. Inside, silence has already pronounced judgment, but silence does not end with words of dissolution. It lingers in symbols, in marginalia, in maps that may or may not mean more than they appear. To move from La Rochelle to Avignon is to move between two languages of silence, one of suppression, the other of possibility. Picture the archivist who first opened the Carta di Sabatier in modern times. He unrolls the paper, smooths its creases, adjusts his glasses under dim light. At first, he sees only lines, crude and simple. Then he recognizes shapes that should not be there. His breath catches. He wonders if he has stumbled on proof of voyages long denied. But soon doubt presses in. The coastline is close but not exact. The dates are hazy. The watermark is real but ambiguous. He places the map back in its drawer. The silence remains intact. This too is how silence works, not always through fire or omission, but through ambiguity that resists resolution. A map that might mean everything or nothing holds silence as surely as a locked chest. The bells toll again, slower now, blending with the murmur of sea and the shuffle of parchment. The forest of the narrative thickens here. Mist curls between trunks, shapes loom in shadows, paths diverge. One leads outward to the Atlantic, to speculation of hidden voyages. Another leads inward, back to Avignon, to the halls where silence was crafted in law. Both paths exist simultaneously, like the two tracks of record we saw before. They never converge, but they frame the journey of memory. The spiral appears again in thought, pulling the reader inward to contemplation. The crescent gleams as a bay, half lit, half hidden. The fish swims quietly through shoals, inked on the margin of the map. The symbols have migrated from testimony to geography, reminding us that silence itself is migratory, traveling through genres, disguises, and centuries. The air grows colder. The bells toll once more, not from La Rochelle, not from Avignon, but from the echo chamber of time itself. They carry you forward, out of the map and into the next set of echoes, the monuments of stone, the towers and vaults that claim, or are claimed, to bear the Templars' mark. The silence of ink yields now to the silence of stone, heavy and immovable, waiting in places like Newport and Malta. And so Chapter 2 closes in resonance. The bells binding maps and manuscripts, ports and papal courts. The silence shaped by clerks and scribes now stretches outward into seas and coasts, into monuments debated. Before we leave it, let the thought linger like mist at dawn. If you've found this journey through margins and maps worth keeping company with, perhaps you might like, subscribe, or share. It keeps the bells tolling softly, carrying voices not meant to be lost. The Loire drifts quietly past Chinon, its waters grey and slow, brushing the moss-covered stones of the fortress where 3 cardinals once sat in judgment. The wind carries the scent of damp leaves and earth, the kind of air that clings to cloisters and castle walls. It was here, in 1308, that the fate of the Knights Templar bent sharply, though no one present could have known how much of the story would remain hidden for centuries. Within these walls, testimonies were heard, confessions weighed, and absolution granted. The ink dried on the Chinon parchment, a record of pardon issued in the name of Pope Clement V. Yet the world would never be told. Imagine the chamber, vaulted stone, torches sputtering, wax dripping onto the table. The cardinals leaned close, their red robes glowing faintly in the firelight. Across from them sat the leaders of the Templars, weary men whose faces bore the marks of imprisonment. They had been accused of spitting on the cross, of denying Christ, of unspeakable rites. The accusations hung in the air like smoke. But here, behind fortress walls, the cardinals pressed them, heard their faltering words, and at last pronounced forgiveness. Absolvit, he absolved them. The word is still visible on the parchment, dark letters against pale skin. It was not condemnation, it was mercy, and yet mercy never left the fortress. The parchment itself carries its own atmosphere. Its fibers are thick, roughened by time, its edges browned by centuries. The wax seal cracked long ago, a crescent fracture marking the place where authority once pressed down. Scholars who touch it today feel both awe and unease. It is a document that contradicts history as it was lived. For if the knights were pardoned here in secrecy, how did they burn in Paris 6 years later? In March of 1314, Jacques de Molay stood before the flames on the Ile de la Cité, declaring with his last breath that the order was innocent, that his brothers were faithful. The fire rose, consuming his body while the crowd muttered prayers and curses. Smoke stung their eyes, sparks drifted upward into a sky already darkened with dusk. His words, carried briefly on the wind, vanished into the roar of flames. No one in that square had heard the absolution recorded at Chinon. No one shouted that the Pope had already pardoned the men. The silence between fortress and city was more lethal than the fire itself. The paradox lingers. On one track, the secret record whispers mercy. On the other, the public stage thunders guilt. Both are true, both exist, yet they never meet. This is the rhythm of the Templars' end. Forgiveness buried, punishment displayed. It is as if history itself wore 2 faces, one solemn, one savage, never reconciled. You can imagine standing at Chinon, touching the damp stone where the cardinals once sat. The smell of moss and river fills the air. Your hand rests on the wall, cold and unyielding. You close your eyes and hear faint echoes of Latin prayers, the murmurs of knights swearing loyalty to Christ once more, the voices of cardinals absolving them. Then open your eyes, and you are on the banks of the Seine, watching fire devour the last Grand Master. Both scenes live together, overlapping, irreconcilable. The Chinon parchment was not lost by accident. It was placed carefully in the papal archive, where it remained unread for centuries. Why hide a pardon? Why grant absolution in secret, but let condemnation proceed in public? Some argue Clement was trapped, forced by the demands of King Philippe IV. Others see political calculation. The Pope wished to preserve the possibility of mercy in his conscience while satisfying the hunger for punishment in the world. The The parchment thus became a mirror of his divided will. The document itself bears signs of haste. The handwriting is clear but uneven, as though the pen moved with urgency. The ink pools in places darker where the scribe pressed too hard. The Latin phrasing is precise, legalistic, yet between its lines lies weariness. It reads not like triumph, but like a concession, a record made to close a chapter rather than to open one. When modern scholars unrolled it in 2001, they found not thunder, but a sigh, a quiet voice whispering across time. And still the image of fire in Paris refuses to fade. Torches snapping in the wind, smoke curling into the sky, chains glowing red as they heat. The crowd shifting, some shouting, some silent. The bells of Notre Dame tolling, their sound mixing with the crackle of flames. To imagine this scene alongside the parchment's absolution is to feel history tearing itself in two, pardoned and yet burned, absolved and yet dissolved. The bells toll still, faint across centuries. They remind us that history is not consistent. It is not a single voice but a chorus, often discordant. Some voices are amplified, others silenced. Some are written in bold proclamation, others tucked away in drawers. The Chinon parchment was the softer voice, hidden for generations, leaving the louder voice of fire to dominate memory. Only now do we hear both together, and their dissonance is as haunting as the echo of bells across a misty river. One detail in the parchment catches the eye, the crack of wax shaped like a crescent. It mirrors the crescent marks in margins of other documents, symbols of secrecy, of night. Perhaps coincidence, perhaps a clerk's idle hand, but the repetition resonates. The moon hovers over these records, a silent witness to what was forgiven and what was forgotten. You lean closer, and the parchment seems to breathe. The letters pulse faintly in the lamplight, their edges blurred by centuries, but still strong. The word absolve it carries the weight of mercy denied to the world. It is a word that might have changed history had it been spoken aloud, but it was not. It was folded, filed, and forgotten. Silence triumphed, and yet the parchment survived. Fire did not reach it, mold did not consume it, neglect did not erase it. It endured to whisper again, centuries later. That endurance itself is a kind of rebellion, a sign that silence cannot be perfect. Memory leaks through cracks, through margins, through forgotten drawers. The Chinon parchment is proof that even the most careful silence is never absolute. The river flows past Chinon, carrying reflections of towers and clouds. The Seine flows past Paris, carrying ash into the sea. Between the two rivers lies the paradox of the Templars' fate. Between them lies the silence that condemned them, and the parchment that absolved them. The bells toll once more, their sound softer now, blending with the rustle of leaves, the creak of old wood, the shuffle of parchment. Their echo carries you onward, away from fortress and fire, toward artifacts and monuments equally contested, maps that may show too much, towers that may hide secrets, stones that may carry whispers of an order that refused to vanish entirely. The sea breathes differently than rivers. Rivers murmur in currents and eddies, pulling steadily toward the sea, but the sea itself inhales and exhales with tides, vast lungs that seem to move the whole earth. On the western edge of France, in La Rochelle, the harbour has always smelled of tar and salt, its quays blackened with the scuffs of ropes and anchors. In the 14th century, it was a harbour watched by the Templars. Their towers guarded the shoreline, their ships rode the tide, their warehouses filled with grain, wine, and rumour. It was from here that whispers grew of a fleet that escaped, carrying away treasures, knowledge, or perhaps only themselves. And in the folds of that rumor sits a map, the Carta di Sabatier. Spread across parchment, the map presents coastlines that seem both familiar and wrong. At first, the eye traces Europe easily, the Iberian Peninsula, the sweep of France, the islands scattered in the Atlantic. But further left across the ocean, shapes emerge that ought not to exist. A curve that looks suspiciously like the bulge of Brazil, a line that bends like the shore of Guyana. They are crude, they are faint, yet they stir unease. For if these lines truly represent South America, then someone knew, centuries before, Columbus set sail. The map carries a watermark, an impression pressed into the paper itself during its making. The watermark links the parchment to a batch produced in La Rochelle. The design resembles a cross with flared ends, a common motif, yet its association with the Templars port lends it a weight beyond coincidence. To press watermarked paper into shape was to give identity to the blank surface, a kind of baptism. And here, that baptism ties the map to a harbour heavy with legend. Imagine the map spread on a wooden table in a dim room overlooking the docks. Candles drip onto the floorboards, the flame bending in sea wind. A cartographer leans over the sheet, his quill scratching curves. Outside, gulls shriek and masts groan. His ink pools at the edge of a bay, a crescent curve, a line of mountains drawn like a spine. He cannot know how these lines will be read centuries later. He only copies, adapts, embellishes. But the marks, once dry, whisper across time. Perhaps knowledge travelled farther, perhaps the Templars carried it. The smell of the parchment mingles with salt air, a metallic tang from iron gall ink clinging to nostrils. When modern scholars unrolled the Carta di Sabatier, they smelled that same mixture: sea, ink, mildew. The lines had blurred slightly, the paper warped by damp, but the shape still caught the eye. It demanded interpretation. Was it a coincidence of geometry? Was it evidence of lost voyages? The silence between possibilities is thick, refusing resolution. Critics point out that medieval maps often bore strange coastlines. They were not meant as precise guides, but as symbolic representations. Landmasses might be exaggerated or misplaced, bays invented, rivers stretched. A shape that resembles Brazil may be nothing more than artistic balance, a flourish to fill empty space. To insist otherwise risks reading too much, projecting desire into ink. And yet, why does the resemblance stir so strongly? Why does the heart leap at the possibility that knights sailed west, beyond reach of pope and king? The bells of La Rochelle toll faintly in the distance, their sound bending over the waves. Their rhythm merges with the creak of ships, the slap of water against hulls. In imagination, they become part of the map, as if their sound line could be traced across the ocean to those faint, impossible coasts. Bells have always carried messages farther than voices, and so too do maps. Even when ambiguous, they suggest more than they declare. The watermark is the most stubborn fact. Pressed into the fibres, it anchors the parchment to La Rochelle, to a specific place and time. That port was a Templar stronghold, a place where goods and men and whispers crossed the sea. The mark cannot tell us who held the paper, who drew the lines, who believed them. But it tells us where the silence began. La Rochelle is written not only in ink, but in water, pressed into the skin of parchment. The crescent, the spiral, the fish, symbols we saw in margins, seem to echo here as geography. The crescent curve of a bay, the spiral curl of a river mouth, fish sketched faintly near shoals. It may be imagination's trick, but it feels like continuity, as though the language of silence migrated from trial records into maps. What cannot be said in testimony may be drawn instead in coastlines. Silence adapts, finding new form. The historian leans over the Carta di Sabatier in a modern reading room, light humming overhead. His gloved fingers trace the line of the disputed coast. He hesitates, then writes in his notes. Resemblance is striking, but certainty impossible. He knows he must hedge. To proclaim too much is to risk folly, yet to dismiss entirely is to ignore the unease the map provokes. He closes the file gently, the rustle of parchment loud in the quiet room. The silence of interpretation remains. The bells toll again, slower now, as though reminding us that time itself withholds answers. The sea continues to breathe, its tides erasing and remaking coasts. The map remains, whispering possibilities, daring us to read too much, warning us not to. And just beyond, waiting in the mist of memory, rise towers of stone, a circular structure in Newport, its arches weathered by centuries, its origins debated endlessly. Vaults in Malta sealed and shadowed, their purpose contested. From map to monument, the silence of the Templars moves from ink to stone, carrying its ambiguity into walls that endure longer than parchment. The journey continues from the rustle of maps to the echo of footsteps in ancient towers. The bells fade, the sea exhales, and the silence of stone prepares to take its place in the chorus. The ocean leaves its fingerprints not only on maps but also on stone. Far from La Rochelle, across the Atlantic, in the quiet town of Newport, Rhode Island, a curious structure rises from the ground. A round tower, its arches weathered and uneven, its stones blackened by centuries of wind and salt. It stands in a small park now, surrounded by lawns and modern streets, but its presence resists explanation. Some say it is nothing more than a colonial windmill built by Governor Benedict Arnold in the 17th century. Others whisper it is older, far older, perhaps even the work of Templars who crossed the sea long before Columbus. The tower does not answer, it only endures, stone stacked upon stone, silence hardened into architecture. Step inside the arches and the air changes. The interior is cool, damp, echoing. Light filters through the gaps, falling on stone columns that seem almost Roman in style. The mortar smells faintly of lime, though centuries have blurred its scent. Fingers brush against rough surfaces, the grit clinging to skin. Was this a windmill's base, grinding grain for settlers? Or a chapel, a fortress, a monument of something carried across the ocean? The spiral of speculation rises as steadily as the tower itself. Critics remind us that colonial documents do mention a windmill, that construction techniques align with the 17th century. They argue that romance and imagination have simply stretched the tower backward into myth. Yet the peculiar design lingers. The arches do not look entirely like those of a mere utility. Their curves, their proportions, their shadows hint at something ceremonial. It may be coincidence, but coincidence can feed legends for centuries. The bells of Newport's churches toll faintly in the distance. Their sound wraps around the tower, mingling with the cries of gulls and the hush of waves along the shore. The tower itself seems to toll silently, each arch like a bell mouth, each shadow like a clapper. One can almost imagine the voices of knights, their chants echoing in the damp interior, though history insists such voices never stood here. The silence grows heavier for being unprovable. Across the sea, in the Mediterranean, another structure waits. Vaults beneath Malta, sealed chambers whispered to be linked to the Templars. Malta itself is a crossroads of stone, its limestone fortresses glowing pale in the sun, its harbours deep and strategic. The island later belonged to the Hospitallers, the order that inherited much of the Templars' property. But rumours persist that beneath its streets lie older chambers, carved in secret, their entrances disguised. Imagine descending into such a vault. The air is cool, tinged with damp salt, carrying the smell of centuries of stone. Your footsteps echo on uneven floors, the ceiling low, forcing you to stoop. On the walls, faint carvings catch the light of your torch, crosses, circles, spirals. Some are clear, others weathered into ambiguity. Were they made by Templar hands? Or are they merely the scratches of later masons, their purpose long forgotten? The vault does not tell. Its silence is deeper than any archive. Legends say that treasure lies hidden there. Gold, relics, secret texts carried from Jerusalem. But the vaults have yielded little to excavation, their entrances blocked, their contents empty or ordinary. Still, the idea persists. Silence does not weaken belief, it strengthens it. What is sealed must be hiding something. What is absent invites invention. Malta's vaults thus become part of the same chorus as Newport's tower, artifacts that stand on the border between fact and dream. The bells of Valletta toll above, their sound filtered through stone, muffled but insistent. They mingle with the imagined chants of knights, the shuffle of boots across limestone floors. Outside, the sea crashes against the harbour walls, steel anchors clanging in the wind. The vault breathes with the rhythm of tide and bell, joining the music of silence that binds all these debated places together. Scholars, cautious as always, remind us of counterpoints. The Newport Tower may indeed be no older than the 17th century. Its stones may carry only the story of settlers, not of crusaders. The Maltese vaults may belong only to later fortifications, their carvings incidental. No proof links them firmly to the Templars, but proof is not the only thing that endures. Ambiguity endures as well. And ambiguity is fertile soil for imagination. To stand inside Newport's tower at dusk is to feel the ambiguity in your bones. Shadows lengthen through arches, turning stone into script. Each line of mortar becomes a line of text, but the text cannot be read, only sensed. To stand in Malta's vaults is the same. The carvings are letters in a language no one can confirm, a language of silence. In both places, history refuses clarity, leaving the visitor suspended between belief and doubt. The motifs we have traced before, the crescent, the spiral, the fish, seem to linger even here. The arches of Newport curve like crescents framing the sky. Spirals appear in carvings in Malta, though weathered. Fish swim in the sea that laps against both shores, symbols uniting coasts across an ocean. Whether intentional or coincidental, the echoes persist, reminding us that silence migrates through forms from parchment to map to stone. The bells toll again, slower now, deeper. Their sound resonates through arches and vaults alike, binding Newport and Malta into a single rhythm. They remind us that silence is not nothingness but a presence, heavy as stone, vast as ocean. The structures may be contested, their origins uncertain, but their endurance is undeniable. They stand, and in standing, they whisper. As you step back from the tower, as you climb from the vault, the air feels lighter, but the weight of ambiguity clings. You have touched stone, smelled damp, heard echoes, but you cannot resolve the question. And perhaps resolution was never the point. The silence is the point. The uncertainty is the message. From here, the journey moves not only through artifacts, but through interpretation. For whether maps or towers or vaults, the question is always the same. What did the Templars truly keep? Was it treasure, knowledge, or only the burden of being inconvenient? The next path leads into that speculation, into the idea of the Templars not as hoarders of gold, but as keepers of methods, ideas, ways of seeing that defied easy categorization. And so from the silence of stone we move toward the silence of thought itself. The myths of the Templars often shimmer with gold, chests of coins loaded onto ships, relics hidden in vaults, treasures buried beneath churches. But perhaps their true inheritance was not metal or jewels, perhaps it was method, a way of thinking, of preserving, of learning that did not fit neatly within the boundaries of church and crown. To call them keepers of treasure is to look for glittering surfaces. To call them keepers of method is to sense the silence behind the glitter, the unseen patterns that endured even when their order was destroyed. During the Crusades, the Templars moved constantly between cultures. From Jerusalem to Acre, from Antioch to Cyprus, their lives brushed against merchants, scholars, mystics. They guarded pilgrims along routes where Greek, Arabic, Hebrew, and Latin words mingled in the same markets. They camped in deserts where astronomers charted the skies differently, where physicians mixed herbs unknown in Europe, where philosophers debated with metaphors strange to Western ears. It was in these exchanges, not in locked chests, that their real wealth may have rested. Imagine a knight resting in the shade of a tent outside Acre. The air is heavy with spice, cinnamon and cardamom carried on the breeze. Across from him sits a Muslim scholar, his fingers stained with ink, his speech winding like poetry. They speak through interpreters haltingly, but the knight listens. He learns of algebra, of numerals that carry zero as a number in itself, of ways to measure distance with stars. He cannot grasp it all, but he feels the weight of method. Later, he brings fragments of this knowledge back to Europe, tucked not into coffers but into memory. The Templars built networks, their preceptories dotted Europe like constellations, each one linked by routes of money and message. They developed systems of credit that allowed pilgrims to deposit coins in Paris and withdraw funds in Acre, a method so sophisticated it foreshadowed modern banking. This, too, was a treasure, but it was a treasure of process, of trust, of abstract exchange. To preserve and transmit such methods required discipline, secrecy, and above all, silence. The bells of Europe tolled over fields and towns, and within their echo the Templars learned to adapt sound into system. They measured hours for prayer, but they also used bells as signals, coordinating movements across wide distances. Silence was as important as sound. Knowing when not to speak, when to hide, when to record only in cipher, these skills shaped them as much as sword or shield. Legends say they kept secrets from ancient temples, mysteries drawn from the East. Perhaps it is true that they encountered texts of Jewish mysticism, conversations with Sufi masters, or echoes of Persian philosophy. If so, what they preserved was not a single doctrine, but a method of openness, of weaving threads across traditions. Such weaving was inconvenient to the structures of power which thrived on fixed boundaries, on clear lines of orthodoxy. To move between worlds was to become suspect, to become too fluid for rigid hierarchies. Picture a manuscript carried quietly from Antioch to Paris. Its cover smells of goat leather, its pages darkened by travel. Inside are diagrams, circles within circles, stars linked by lines, words in Arabic and Latin scrawled side by side. The knight who holds it cannot fully read it, but he senses its depth. He files it away in a preceptory library, where a clerk later copies fragments. The method passes on. No one knows the full meaning, yet the shape of thought survives. The crescent, the spiral, the fish, the symbols that haunted margins and maps fit here as metaphors of method. The crescent as openness to what comes at night, what cannot be seen in full. The spiral as the inward turn of contemplation, the process of thought circling deeper. The fish as the sign of hidden community. Knowledge shared only in trust. These motifs, recurring across records and stones, may reflect less on treasure than on the persistence of method, the rhythm of silent preservation. Critics remind us, rightly, that much of this remains speculation. Evidence is fragmentary, suggestive, never conclusive. But speculation itself grows from silence. When treasure is absent, imagination turns to method. And the methods the Templars used of banking, of secrecy, of cross-cultural exchange are undeniable. They left no vault of jewels for us to uncover, but they left habits of thought, habits that shaped Europe quietly, invisibly, persistently. The bells toll again, this time softer, as though echoing from distant cloisters. Their sound merges with the scratch of quills, the shuffle of parchment, the low chant of monks. In this soundscape, you sense what the Templars may truly have guarded. Not relics, not riches, but ways of preserving rhythm. Ways of carrying silence forward, of ensuring that even when words were erased, patterns endured. Jacques de Molay, burning in Paris, declared his brothers innocent. His words rose briefly, then fell into silence. But the methods, the habits, the patterns did not burn. They seeped onward, absorbed into other orders, into financial practices, into architectural choices, into the quiet margins of scholarship. The Templars, as keepers of method, did not vanish. They dissolved into history like ink into fibers, inseparable from the parchment itself. To stand in a library today, surrounded by manuscripts, is to feel their presence. The smell of vellum, the faint trace of iron gall ink, the scratch of silence that clings to margins, it all carries their echo. They are not present as individuals, but as patterns. They are not present as treasure, but as method. Their silence was not emptiness, but discipline, the deliberate shaping of what could be said and what must be hidden. And so when legends speak of treasure, perhaps they are not entirely wrong. But the treasure is intangible, invisible, inconvenient. It is a way of thinking that crossed boundaries, a way of preserving what did not fit the mold. To hold such a treasure was dangerous, for it made them both valuable and suspect. It made them necessary and intolerable. It made them inconvenient. The bells toll once more, their sound deeper now, pulling you onward. The method they kept, the silence they wove, all of it leads toward reflection. For in the end, to study them is to study not what was shouted, but what was whispered, not what was displayed, but what was hidden. The path moves now from speculation to resonance, from method to memory. As chapter 3 closes, the silence prepares to become a mirror. And if this journey into their methods has stirred you, consider letting the thought linger like a bell's echo by sharing, subscribing, or simply carrying the resonance forward. It is a way of keeping company with voices that never shouted but still endured. Bells fade quickly in the air, but silence endures. The Templars' story has been told in fire and parchment, in courtrooms and on scaffolds, yet it is the silence around them that has lasted longest. Their enemies shouted, their accusers proclaimed, their judges decreed. The shouting is gone, but the quiet remains, echoing in archives, in ruins, in the imagination of those who seek them still. Silence outlives sound because it is not bound to any single voice. It seeps into stone, into habits, into the unspoken. In Avignon, Clement V allowed silence to dissolve the order. In Paris, silence allowed fire to consume Jacques de Molay, even as words of absolution rested hidden in drawers. In La Rochelle, silence wrapped itself in maps that might or might not reveal too much. In Newport and Malta, silence hardened into stone, leaving us to guess at origins. The pattern is constant, silence acting not as absence but as presence, stronger than proclamation, more enduring than noise. Imagine standing in a medieval archive. The air smells of dust, parchment, and beeswax polish. Shelves rise high, their spines lined in shadow. When no one speaks, the silence hums, filled with the memory of all that has been written and lost. You turn a page and feel the fragile crackle. Between one word and another lies a gulf of centuries. You listen, and what you hear is not the voices of scribes, but the weight of what was not written. This is how silence survives, not by vanishing, but by pressing itself into every gap. Sound is fleeting. A cry at the stake vanishes with smoke. A papal bull read aloud to a crowd disperses with the wind. A proclamation carved in stone may weather, but silence remains beneath it, shaping interpretation. Even the bells that toll across time do so within silence, their notes framed by stillness, their rhythm marked by pauses. Without silence, sound cannot exist. The Templars' legacy teaches this lesson with painful clarity. The crescent, the spiral, the fish, these symbols were never loud. They hid in margins, in corners, in the quiet edges of records. They remind us that silence itself can speak if one knows how to look. To see them is to sense a resistance that never dared declare itself openly. The silence of symbols outlives the noise of accusations. The noise named them heretics. The silence leaves open the possibility that they were only inconvenient. Picture Jacques de Molay in his final moments. His voice rose above the crackle of fire, declaring innocence, calling God to witness. Those who heard him might have trembled, might have wondered, but his sound was swallowed by flame, scattered in the air. The silence that followed endured. For centuries, the world remembered not his exact words, but the fact of his defiance, carried in silence more than in sound. Scholars debate endlessly, but even their arguments prove the endurance of silence. Every claim contested, every artifact doubted, every map questioned, all of it testifies to the gaps that remain. If the record were clear, the debate would end. But silence ensures the record is never clear, always uncertain, always alive. The Templars' legacy persists not because of certainty, but because of silence. The bells toll again, soft and far, as if heard across valleys and seas. Their sound is brief, yet the silence they leave behind stretches on, filling every corner. You stand in it listening and realize it is not emptiness. It is full of memory, full of possibility. It is the ground on which history walks. In monasteries, silence was cultivated as a discipline. Monks knew it sharpened thought, deepened prayer, cleansed perception. The Templars, though warriors, lived by similar rhythms. Their vows demanded restraint, their rituals woven with pauses, their lives bounded by hours of quiet. To be silent was not to be absent, it was to be vigilant. That vigilance has outlived their voices, carrying their story forward in ways louder than speech could. The spiral returns here as a metaphor. Silence coils inward, drawing thought deeper, pulling sound into its center. The crescent curves around it, enclosing it, giving it form. The fish swims quietly through it, unseen but present. Together they teach that silence is not void, but structure. It frames, it guides, it protects. It has protected the Templars' memory better than any proclamation could have. Step outside the archive, outside the tower, outside the vault. The night is still. Mist curls over the ground. The bells have ceased, but the silence hums with their absence. You feel it in your chest, in your breath. It moves with you, shaping the way you listen. This is the silence the Templars left behind. Not answers, not declarations, but presence. Critics may dismiss the silence as ignorance, as gaps that should be filled with certainty. But perhaps the silence itself is the point. It resists possession. It refuses to be pinned down. It demands that each generation listen anew, interpret anew, imagine anew. That is why their story persists. That is why their memory is never settled. Silence is their truest legacy. The bells toll once more, imagined now, not real, yet no less resonant. They remind you that sound fades, but silence carries on. The Templars have no voice left. Their records are fractured, their monuments contested, yet their silence continues, weaving through maps, margins, and myths stronger than any cry of condemnation. And as the silence settles around you, heavy but alive, it draws you toward reflection, toward the ways in which absence shapes presence, how doubt outlives certainty, how whispers outlast shouts. From here, the story moves deeper into that reflection, into the idea of history itself as an art of listening to silence. To read history is not only to read what is written, but to attend to what is missing. A page is never flat. Its words rise and fall like relief carved into stone, and between them run channels of silence, spaces where meaning hides. With the Templars, those channels are deeper than most. Their story survives in fragments, bulls, decrees, confessions, maps, towers. Yet what gives those fragments weight is not what they declare, but what they refuse to say. Reading between the lines is the only way to hear the echoes of what has been silenced. Imagine sitting with a Templar register before you. The ink has browned with time, the parchment curled at its edges. You run a finger down the lines of Latin script, each letter shaped with patient hand. The sentences seem clear, their rhythm steady, confession, condemnation, closure. Yet as you move from word to word, you feel the pull of what is absent. The margins hum with unfinished thought. The last pages shift uneasily with their stitched addenda. You begin to sense that the true story is not in the text itself, but in the spaces around it. Historians speak of gaps in the record, but gaps are not nothing. They are presence in another form. A missing book listed in an inventory is still a trace. A smudged page that once carried a plea is still testimony. A line struck through, a correction added, a phrase softened. These all whisper of tension. To read between the lines is to listen for these whispers, to treat silence as evidence. Take again the Chinon parchment. Its words are clear. Absolution, granted. But beside that clarity lies centuries of silence, during which no one acted on its message. The gap between word and deed is itself part of the record. It tells us that absolution existed, but also that it was buried. To read between the lines is to hear both at once, the mercy written and the silence that smothered it. Or think of the Carta di Sabatier, the coastline drawn, perhaps too accurate, perhaps mere coincidence. The silence of interpretation stretches around it, as vast as the ocean it depicts. To read between the lines of the map is to hear not only the waves, but the longing of those who wish the Templars had sailed farther, escaped more fully, lived beyond the reach of kings. The Newport Tower, the Maltese vaults, stone filled with ambiguity. Reading them requires the same skill as reading parchment. Look not only at what is present, the arches, the carvings, the stones, but at the silence that surrounds them, the absence of proof, the persistence of rumour. Silence here is not void, it is invitation. It asks the reader to step in, to imagine, to balance skepticism with wonder. In this way, history itself becomes a dialogue between sound and silence. The sound is what is declared, the bull of vox in Excelso, the sentences of condemnation, the flames of execution. The silence is what lingers beneath, hesitation, regret, contradiction. To read both together is to experience the full resonance. Ignore the silence, and the record feels thin, brittle, too certain. Attend to it, and the record deepens, becomes layered, becomes alive. Picture yourself in a scriptorium centuries ago. Monks bend over desks, their quills scratching, the air heavy with incense and wax. One pauses, rubs his eyes, glances at the margin. He doodles a crescent, then returns to his text. Another copies carefully, but at the end he stitches an extra sheet, his hand trembling with fatigue. They cannot say aloud what they feel, but their silence leaks into the page. Centuries later, when you sit in the same silence, you hear them still. Reading between the lines is not only an act of scholarship, it is an act of empathy. It requires feeling the weight of what could not be said, of what was forbidden, of what was erased. It means listening not only to voices of authority, but to the tremors of clerks, the hesitations of popes, the protests of prisoners. Their silence is part of their voice. The bells toll faintly, a reminder that history always arrives in fragments. The sound carries, then fades, leaving silence behind. Each toll is like a word in a sentence, but the meaning comes as much from the pauses as from the notes. The Templars' history is a tolling bell with long silences between. To hear it fully, one must honor both. Critics may argue this approach risks imagination overwhelming evidence. They are right to be cautious. But evidence itself is never whole. It is always surrounded by absence, always framed by silence. To deny the silence is to deny half the record. To acknowledge it is not to invent, but to accept incompleteness as part of truth. The spiral motif returns here, perfectly suited. To read between the lines is to follow the spiral inward, deeper into what is unsaid. The crescent curves around it, enclosing silence like a vessel. The fish swims across margins, reminding us that hidden meanings travel quietly. Together they form the grammar of silence, the language between languages. Step back from the page and you see not only what was written, but the shape of its silences. Step back from the tower and you see not only stone, but the space it encloses. Step back from history and you see not only events, but the pauses, the contradictions, the ambiguities. Reading between the lines means holding all of this at once, listening for the hum that lingers after the sound is gone. The bells toll once more, low and slow. Their resonance fades into night, leaving you in stillness. That stillness is not emptiness. It is the presence of everything unsaid, everything waiting to be heard. From here, the story turns more inward, into reflection, into the art of listening to silence itself. When you lean into silence, it begins to reflect, not like a polished mirror of silver or glass, but like a still pond at dusk. The surface does not shout, it waits. It holds the sky, the trees, the fading light. Step too close, and ripples distort the image, but remain patient, and the water reveals not only what is above, but what lies beneath. Shadows of roots, drift of silt, slow movements unseen. So too with history. Silence is its mirror. In it, one sees both what was intended to be shown and what was hidden beneath. The Templars' silence reflects more than their own fate. It reflects the structures around them, papacy, monarchy, the machinery of law. Clement's pauses mirror his political entanglement, Philippe's demands, his fear of illness and weakness. The clerk's marginal symbols mirror their doubt, their conscience resisting the pressure of conformity. The maps with uncertain coastlines mirror the imagination of ages, longing for escape beyond reach. Silence reveals not only the knights but also the world that judged them. Imagine a chamber in Avignon, candles burning low, wax dripping onto stone. Clement sits hunched, his quill idle, his breath shallow. He writes little, but his silence says much. To read it is to see the reflection of a papacy caught between king and god. His silence mirrors the fragility of power itself, showing that even at the height of authority, words can fail, leaving only absence. Now imagine a clerk in a dim scriptorium, his hand tired, his eyes straining. He copies dutifully but slips a crescent in the margin. His silence mirrors his unease, his refusal to let guilt be the only voice. The crescent is not a protest shouted aloud, but a reflection of conscience bending into shape on the edge of the page. The Newport Tower, the Maltese vaults, they too are mirrors. Their ambiguity reflects not certainty, but longing. The tower mirrors the desire of later centuries to believe in hidden voyages. The vaults mirror the imagination of treasure buried beneath stone. They reveal less about the Templars themselves than about us, those who gaze at them, those who hunger for mystery. Silence does not only mirror the past, it mirrors the reader, the listener, the seeker. The bells toll faintly, each note sending ripples across silence. Between them, you hear yourself listening. That is the mirror at work. History reflecting back not only knights and kings, but also the hunger of those who return to the story. Silence is not empty. It is a surface where desire, fear, and wonder gaze upon themselves. Critics resist this. They warn that silence cannot be evidence, that imagination risks distortion. Yet even their resistance is a reflection. It mirrors the demand for certainty, the discomfort with ambiguity. To stare into silence is to risk seeing oneself as much as the past. It is easier to cling to proclamations, to fire and bulls, to written sentences. Harder to attend to silence, for silence reflects back doubt. The Chinon parchment, with its hidden absolution, mirrors the duality of the Church, merciful in secret, condemning in public. The flames of Paris mirror the power of kings, burning away what resisted them. The map of La Rochelle mirrors the sea's vastness, the longing for escape. The tower and vault mirror stones' endurance, the persistence of questions. Together these reflections show that history is not a single face, but a hall of mirrors, each silence bending light differently. Picture yourself standing at a still pond in a forest. Mist curls low, trees bend overhead. The surface is dark, yet it holds the world inverted. When you gaze into it, you see sky and branch, but also your own outline. The Templars' silence is that pond. Look long enough and you see not only them but also yourself. your questions, your desires, your doubts. That is why their story persists. It is not only about them, but about what we find reflected. The spiral returns here, not only as a symbol of secrecy, but as a mirror, turning inward. Each curve reflects the previous one, smaller, deeper, repeating into infinity. The crescent, too, is a mirror, the moon reflecting light it does not create. The fish swims in water, its shape visible only because the surface mirrors its movement. These motifs were not chosen by accident in margins and maps. They belong to silence's grammar, silence's mirror. Sound may proclaim, but it fades. Silence reflects, and in reflecting, it endures. The Templars were condemned by proclamations, yet remembered through silence. They were judged by noise, but they live on in absence. Their story is not the story of heresy proven, but of silence that mirrors the fragility of authority and the persistence of doubt. The bells toll once more, carrying across mist. Their sound ripples the pond, but the silence that follows is deeper, clearer. You see your own outline again, mingled with branches and sky. That is history's mirror. It reveals the past, but always entangled with the present. The Templars' silence is our silence too. As chapter 4 draws toward its close, let the mirror rest for a moment. Let the reflection linger. If this journey into silence has stirred something in you, perhaps you might like, subscribe, or share. Not as a proclamation, but as a way of keeping the reflection alive, as a way of letting silence continue to mirror across voices. And from here, the path leads gently toward the final chapter, where the silence itself slows, lengthens, and softens into the rhythm of night. The bells that have tolled across these hours grow slower now. Their bronze voices no longer rush or insist, but drift like echoes through mist, as though each note is stretching itself thin to last a little longer. Beyond the bells, the world falls quiet, yet the silence does not feel empty. It feels alive, full of memory, of breath, of things once spoken and long since dissolved. The story of the Templars settles into that silence, their noise burned away, their whispers folded into time. Picture a medieval forest at dusk. The air is cool, damp with moss, the ground soft beneath your feet. Steel lies forgotten under oak leaves, its blade dulled, its hilt wrapped in vines. A faint fog curls around the trunks, carrying the smell of earth and wood smoke. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolls one last time, its sound muffled by branches, its rhythm softened by distance. When it fades, only the forest breathes. That breath is the same breath that carries history forward, slow, steady, endless. The Templars themselves are gone, their names recorded, their bones scattered, their castles turned to ruin or absorbed into new hands. Yet silence carries them still. It holds the Chinon parchment, folded and hidden. It holds the margins with crescents and spirals, their ink trembling in candlelight. It holds the maps that may or may not reach across oceans, and the towers and vaults that may or may not belong to them. All of it lingers, not in certainty but in quiet reflection. Silence has outlived accusation. It has outlived fire. It will outlive us too. You may imagine Clement V at the very end of his life, frail, his body failing, his breath rattling. The papal palace stands hushed around him, tapestries heavy on walls, servants whispering in corridors. He has spoken much less in these last months, letting others write for him. His silence now is not political, but physical, the silence of a man who can no longer command words. In that final hush, perhaps he reflected on what he had allowed. An order dissolved, without guilt declared, Men burned despite absolution given. His silence was verdict, but it was also mirror. And in the end, it became his only language. The clerks too fade into silence. Their quills are dry, their candles extinguished, their hands dust. But the crescents, spirals and fish they left behind continue to glow faintly on parchment. They are fragments of conscience, preserved not as sound but as shape. To find them centuries later is to feel a pulse in silence, a small vibration that says, not everything was erased. Something resisted, something remains. The Newport Tower still rises, its arches dark against the sky. The Maltese vaults remain sealed, their stones cool to the touch. The sea breathes against La Rochelle, waves striking quays where Templar ships once stood. These places are not loud, they do not proclaim. They wait, like ponds holding reflections, like bells waiting for the next toll. Their silence is not absence, it is endurance. The spiral returns once more, curling inward until it becomes stillness. The crescent hovers above, pale and calm, reflecting borrowed light. The fish swims unseen in quiet water, moving without sound, present without proclamation. These motifs gather here at the end, not as puzzles to solve, but as companions in silence. They remind us that history is not only made of declarations, but of the spaces between. Step once more into the forest. The mist is thicker now, muffling every branch and stone. Steel lies rusted in the undergrowth, bells echo faintly in memory, and the path narrows into darkness. Yet the silence is soft, not frightening. It cradles rather than condemns. It invites rest, the way monks once rested after prayers, the way knights once rested after campaigns. Silence is the final rhythm, the long exhale after centuries of noise. The bells toll one last time, then fall still. Their echoes fade into distance, merging with the hum of wind through trees, with the quiet lap of river against stone, with the breath of the night itself. The steel is buried, the smoke has drifted away. The parchment lies closed, its margins glowing faintly in memory. And all that remains is silence, vast, patient, enduring. May you rest within it too. May the silence that carried the Templars now carry you, slow and steady through the night. The forest breathes, the mist curls, the bells no longer call. Only stillness remains. Sleep comes gently, born on silence, born on memory, born on time itself.